I'd like to welcome everyone online. See, there we already have Arthur. Hi, Arthur. Please feel free to just post your names and where you're working from in the chat box. Some house rules for today, and as we go on in this series, is the question and answers. Please put your question and answers to our panelists in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll fill them from there. And if you want to share anything, maybe just if you want to share your details, where you're from, put that in the participant box. But it's welcome very much to CST's Thursday webinar series. We've been running these series of webinars from the beginning of the lockdown, and we see as the world is opening up more and more, we're still glad to have a good participation and excitement for our webinars, and we're really glad that you have time to share your time with us. From today, the 1st of October, South Africa's borders are theoretically open, but then we'll see how movement happens. So I think people's schedules are being more busy than usual. So just welcoming also our two panelists today, Dr. Chantal Naidoo, who's related to the University of Sussex. She'll be sharing some of her work that she did for a PhD. And also responding to her presentation will be Dr. Nthabi Mohlakoana, who is a researcher and lecturer at the CST, and also with a focus on energy work. So thank you very much, Nthabi and Chantal, for sharing your time and your work with us today. And I'll just briefly ask you to each introduce yourselves, maybe just say where you are, what you're where on, and where you're associated and affiliated with.
Shall I go first? Okay, great. Thank you very much, Rika and Nthabi, for this chance to share my research. I recently came back to South Africa, just slipped in before the lockdown happened, from Brighton, where I was staying for 4.5 years. And I've come back with a portfolio that's a little bit of both academic work with Sussex University, as well as working with the European Climate Foundation on issues around energy transitions and finance. And I'll speak a little bit more about my background when I give the presentation.
Thank you very much. Nthabi.
Thank you, Rika and Chantal. Okay, hello everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today from wherever you are. My name is Nthabi Mohlakoana. I'm a researcher working at Stellenbosch University's Center for Complex Systems and Transition. And I'm currently working on projects analyzing the energy transition process in South Africa from the social and policy research perspective. My background in energy research stems from energy poverty studies, energy access and use, gender and energy, doing research there, and of course, energy transitions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Such a huge field of work and such an important field of work today, and especially in across the world, but especially also in Africa and South Africa. Yeah, so we won't waste any more time, just to say that it's extremely windy here in Cape Town. So if you see me moving, or if you hear strange sounds, it's just the wind blowing here, being the southeaster that it is. Just to say, I'll put my screen off so that things don't fall apart. Chantal, please go ahead and share your presentation with us. We're looking forward to that very much.
Thank you. I want to also preface that we've been having electrical storms in Johannesburg. So between you being blown away and me being zapped from thunder, this could be a very interesting hour. Let's see, let's get to my presentation. Here we go. Is that visible, Rika and Nthabi?
Yeah? Yeah, it's perfect.
Okay, so I'm going to start my story with a little bit of my journey first, so you appreciate how I came to the research focus that I have. My finance experiences to date I've been very fortunate. I did a BCom at UCT and started a quest, I guess, through the whole spectrum and gambit of finance type jobs. Tax advisor with Arthur Andersen, which is now no more. investment banking in various setups, so M&A and debt capital markets. I had time as a failed entrepreneur where friends called me from banker to bag lady. I was going to sell, try and fix South Africa's fixation with plastic bags and get cloth bags. This is way in 2008, 2009. That didn't work out very well at the time. I moved to DBSA and worked as both development / green banker within DBSA, and then left in 2012 and started working with the Green Climate Fund and various NGOs and others. And all the time, I guess I can only say this on reflection, was looking back to try and find some purpose for finance. I went into private sector, I went into public sector, and I was looking at something that just helped me better understand what finance does and contributes to society as a whole. But in all of my finance experiences, I think what I came up with was that there's a strong fixation on the narrative around risk and return and projects, and everybody and the bankers being happy, whether they development bankers or investment bankers. It was always a fixation with what their needs were, and this never sat well with me ever. I now work in a philanthropic fund which is focused on the transitions, as I said up front, and with a bit of the academic support now that I've completed the PhD. My challenge and my passion over all these years of work has been around the purpose of finance, and specific in environmental and climate issues. I was concerned with what is the role, especially for finance ministries and policymakers in climate action, and that became clearer to me as time went by. So the hypothesis in my mind was forming that there's a systemic role that they have, which is not just the role of defining projects and budget line items, but I did not have that policy language to communicate these ideas, which is what led me on to my academic journey at Sussex. The word transition came to me when I was working on the Green Fund for DBSA, and we were trying to design this national fund in a way that it would do something. And the word transition in my mind just kept playing over and over again, about movement, about shifts. And it really seeded what then became a preoccupation about concerns on transition-related issues around finance. I became worried that we look into the financial system only to get us more money to finance particular projects. What also became apparent to me was that financiers seemed to be driving those projects and driving those pathways. So what was financeable got financed, but that was not necessarily what needed to happen in terms of the needs of of a transition or the needs of responding to climate change, which is varied, and people basket it together as mitigation or adaptation, but it could be more than that. What I also was concerned about was the shallowness and the short-termism of some of the responses that one saw. And what I meant by that, it was, well, we'll design some fancy instrument and that'll fix it. Or we will make sure we can issue bonds, and the bonds, we will call them green, we'll call them sustainable, we'll call them impact bonds, and then we'll be fine. And then we don't have to do more. I also became concerned with the global north, global south dynamics, and the fact that premature, inappropriate options might be imported to developing country context, but they were unsuited because of the type of financial systems that you have in developing countries. And I think it all boiled down to, well, if we're really trying to move there into a sustainable pathway, aren't we just creating unsustainable ways of achieving that sustainable journey? And then we're going to find ourselves back at the place where we are now. So this was what at the back of my mind. I went in the academic part of the story is people in my first paper, one of the critics was that, but there's a long association between finance and sustainability. This is not new. And that's true. It isn't new. So since 1988, just after the Brundtland Commission, the first connection between finance and sustainability was established. And that opened up many windows into all different types of narratives around finance-related responses. I've listed some of that there. This is a scoping review, which is just picking up the key terms that links finance and sustainability, the kind of research that it covers, and since when. So the earliest research I could find was actually in '88. And that just kept on, building over the years. Not much on transition-specific elements, and a lot of this research outside of the mainstream hardcore finance schools or business schools and mainstream economic schools as well. So definitely niches evolving. And I became uncertain whether any of this past research was helpful for adequately framing, what does finance have to do in a transition context? And I was inspired then. I came across a quote, and my supervisors eventually discouraged me from going down that route. But I was captivated by Antonio Gramsci's definition or framing of what happens when an old system that is dominant is fighting for survival, and a new system is about to be formed, but it's still struggling to emerge. And he described it as an interregnum, the time in between the two, which is a time of discontinuity, chaos, disruption. And he specifically said very morbid symptoms are bound to occur during that time. It's a term specific to change of kings, in England, but it just captures so beautifully for me that tension that a transition context arises. And the picture on the right was developed for my thesis specifically to visually help me connect with what I was trying to say and convey, and what I also grapple with. So my starting question was very much that: what does finance need to respond to? And there is useful work by Carlotta Perez and Mary O'Sullivan, who are two economists who write about innovation and innovation processes. And they had a very simple hypothesis, which really captured me. If you look at the characteristics of the innovation process, that can help you inform what the demand for finance is. And I thought, well, let's try this out on, if I understand the characteristics of a transition process, what would that then mean in terms of the demands it places on the financial system? It's a bit of an inversion in the sense that the driver is the need, the transition context, and the respondent is the financial system. And I held that as my framing. And what I discovered, transition processes have very specific characteristics. This is not all my discovery, it's a synthesis of research and things that I then built on. Sustainability transitions is a field all on its own. Colleagues at CST know this well, and they all have contributed to it in some way or the other. I've taken what I've read out there, consolidated it in a form, and added to it in a way that helps me try to frame the demands on finance. So 5 stood out for me. First of all, transition processes have a very specific direction, and that direction is away from unsustainable and way to sustainable, related investments and practices specific to finance. And there's a temporality dimension to it. There's short, medium, long term, and transition processes historically have taken over 50 years to unfold, but we don't have that luxury. The science tells us we have to accelerate the response. We need not so much incremental or gradual, but we need something that is fast-tracked. And also, transitions have a specific system effect. And that effect is both creating something new and simultaneously trying to disrupt and destabilize the old system. Fourthly, there's a social context, which is, one might say, is new, but not new rather, but even more so in a transition process, that for financiers, it's not just the shareholder that matters and the shareholder returns of the project-specific intervention. There are a much broader set of stakeholders that have a picture of how that transition might unfold. And there are elements at stake around, who wins, who loses, who benefits, and the disruptive effect on loss of jobs. So the elements of justice and inclusivity are even more pronounced in a transition context. And lastly, the things that money doesn't really like to do very much, does it? Experimentation. Everyone wants certainty. Transitions do not offer you that certainty. It requires more adaptive investment mindsets, elements around how to embrace uncertainty. And there's not much room for failed investments, and yet in the context of a transition process, experimentation offers so much learning at the same time, but these are not yet elements that we necessarily embrace. So holding this constant, I then looked at the South African example. I took a historical view of our energy transition from 94 to 2019. I was very lucky to have access to 30 really wonderful informants in the South African context who offered me repeated interviews and engagements over a 2-year period. Documents, sitting and analyzing documents, really geeky PhD stuff in terms of lots of analysis, access to a very confidential database at the IPP office. And also I had worked at the DBSA when the IPP process was just starting in between 2009 and 2012. And as you well know, those that are close to South Africa's energy transition, it's a crowded space, it's a noisy space, and everybody is involved in some way or the other. This is a picture that Brenda Martin developed and kindly allowed me to share, just to show a map of all the stakeholders involved, and probably each having their own idea of what energy transition in South Africa would look like. So our story. In terms of time, I classified it since 94, and it's not very visible, but I can make these slides available and also the link to my thesis if that's helpful. But try to show the policy milestones over the time and the financing flows over the time. Between 94 and 2008 or so, I really struggled to find anything substantive in terms of finance flows, but we had a lot of developmental support in the early days in terms of seeding new policies and some pilot programs that might never really went to scale, but there was a long story before our golden age of renewable energy investment emerged with the first IPP rounds. By 2011, there was a lot happening under the surface, even though for a long time nothing was happening. So you would recall our long lines in our democracy. It's always a moment we mark our history from 94. Energy access was critical in those earlier years, and equity to just bring on board those who did not have access to electricity. The first turning point between 2007 to 2010 was around the first Eskom blackouts and our energy crisis, leading us to Medupe, Kusile, and at the same time also clean technology loans, as well as fast-tracking our energy policies. And the golden age represents a whole lot of investment, over $20 billion that happened over that time. And then we hit a roadblocks and just what I call a malaise, not really knowing what we're doing, where we're going, and a lot of tension over that time. And by the end of last year, which is the time my thesis ends its data gathering exercise and analysis, it looked like there was a turning point with Eskom restructuring, determinations being imminent, the IRP being released, and then COVID, of course, which changes quite a bit for all of us. What I discovered in this story was that there was something that was happening that was far more important than the money. The $20 billion was fantastic, and everybody applauds South Africa's renewable energy program as being highly successful. Anton Eberhard writes that the financial sector was very critical in the success of the IPP program. And his research then moves more into the IPP office, how it was set up, and various other elements around that. But he sparked, his writings and that of Lucy Baker sparked an interest in me about why and how were they so critical? Because to me it seemed that it was more than just money. And what I discovered during the interviews was that there was intense dialogue that actually happened between the banks and the IPP office, at the time represented by officials from Department of Energy and National Treasury, that ensued. And they started from 2009, and those initial focus was around what would it take for the banks to invest in their REI4P. They spoke about risk, they spoke about the governance arrangements, they spoke about the fact that Treasury wanted standardized documentation and what is the risk parameters that this needs to entail. PE was discussed, and various other requirements were brought to the table until they got to the place where we had standard documentation. Everybody that I interviewed applauds those dialogues as being so critical for allowing the banks at least a 9 to 10 month window to prepare investment and risk committees for what was to come, in the sense that it was a new asset class, it was private sector, it was a different type of technology, and to get themselves up to speed about and on structuring and what internal requirements they might need. Those conversations never stopped, which is very exciting for me. They did stop during the time, or they took on rather a different nature when the request for proposals was open and financial close. They became far more bilateral on individual transactions for financial close. But after financial close, there was a continued conversation around evolving in terms of the learnings that came from the funded deals, the funding gaps, and the social dimensions, and whether the social objectives in terms of social enterprise development, BEE funding, community trust involvement, and beneficiation, and how those were unfolding. So the IPP office, to my mind, was they took the trouble to keep talking to the banks, to keep learning and trying to improve on the financing of the renewable energy program. Specifically, though, the nature of these discussions focus primarily on transactional related issues, not so much the effect of an energy transition or how else it might unfold. And what was fascinating for me as well is that most of the banks expanded their teams. They had funding commitments lined up. They were ready from a capabilities point of view for the rolling procurement program. So I quickly just take us back one step to the SA's financial system. It is, this is my own depiction of it and how I kind of make sense of it in terms of regulators like the Reserve Bank and the Financial Services Board, Credit Regulator, National Treasury, a whole slew of private investors, institutional investors, obviously all are not named, a number of public financial intermediaries and a number of private financial intermediaries. But standing behind this, of course, is also the shadow banking system, more of the informal engagements and savings and others that are there. What's not depicted here is even the digital channels and digital technologies that might be evolving as well. So my insights from the data that I gathered, I first looked at direction. In terms of coal and renewable energy investments, the financing unfolded in a very ambiguous way, and that was largely driven by government putting out both coal and renewable energy procurement programs. And one of the quotes that really stands out for me is that there was nothing specific in our energy transition story in terms of direction. A banker unnamed said the greenness did not have much to do with it. It was just a useful framing so that more funding could be unlocked from development agencies who cared about the greenness. But the banks locally would have invested anyway because it was a very well structured program, and in terms of project finance and risk mitigation, it was well wrapped together and feasible enough for them to fund. In terms of system effects, as I just framed this up earlier from the characteristics of transition processes, what was fascinating for me was if you look at the financial reports of almost all of the 4 banks, all of them will write very beautifully about, and I don't mean that cynically, but write very beautifully about their support of the IPP program and the contribution to clean energy. And all of that is the truth. But if you disaggregate, and I had fortunately sight to this data from the IPP office perspective, who financed what, right? There is a differentiation on how the financing happened, and the large program was favored more so than the smalls program. There was one loan bank that financed largely the smalls program. And there was nothing wrong with either, as one of the bankers actually said. He said that the banks were spoilt, and the smalls program would have probably been as invested in as the large program if it was launched first. But of course, it's a volumes transactional cost game. That's what they'll say. But the system effect, one of the system effects was to, have both an environmental and social impact. But we did not necessarily achieve that in terms of both large and small programs. Further insight comes from the social context. I love this picture. It's a picture taken outside of Standard Bank. It was a general meeting when in the room was an NGO fighting, Jashe was fighting for Standard Bank to look at fossil fuel policies and investing, and outside were other NGOs looking at the equity of it. And the question, if coal is the answer, what was the question, really stands out for me as catching quite a bit. What was fascinating is that while all four of the banks have, to some degree, now policies that are not investing in either fossil fuels or limited investment for new fossil fuel energy source investments, at the back end of the civil action was what pushed for these investment shifts. And they continued to put pressure around disclosure and consistency of action. And that's a really important part of our transition story and the financing of our transition story. There's also landmark legal cases which affect the due diligence processes of the banks. And if you bring, and as some of the NGOs brought that to the attention of the banks, those are also things that led to the shift in policies on investing in new coal. The section on the right around experimentation deals with how a typical deal is actually structured. And just putting that together, I started trying to understand in the interviews, sort of where did the innovation happen in terms of financial structuring and the dimensions of evolving as the program became a little bit more mature. How did all of this financial innovation unfold? And what was fascinating for me is at the level of, I guess, I hope you can see my cursor, but the Renewable Energy Project Company, there was really beautiful and interesting innovations that unfolded, starting out with, leading up to CPI-linked loans, where it didn't start out that way. And that evolved, and even creating new investment funds to help support the CPI-linked debt. What was disappointing, though, was that the empowerment shareholder funding on that piece was exactly the same as what I remember from working at African Merchant Bank a long time ago, let's not say years, but a long time ago, around how these empowerment deals were actually funded. There didn't seem to be much change around that. And I found that fascinating because there was something incompatible about being able to have deep financial innovation and sophistication at one level, and then something that was just not so much so. And why does that matter? Because in this case here, empowerment shareholders were locked in for at least almost 17 years with some kind of trickle dividend. Whereas in this context, there was much earlier exit mechanisms. And I just thought there's something not quite right about the equity of that setup. And this is a concern that the IPP Office started raising and started working on to create a better way of funding this portion, which is critical in a much more innovative and equitable way. And thankfully, IPP Office continues to maintain this dialogue. So my key data takeaways then from just looking at that set of data was that dialogue was really helpful for the program design, the ongoing learnings, and also making the funding flow from the banks, most of which came from local banks and funding institutions, and others came from international. So 26% or so came from international. But underlying the dialogue was a lot of unspoken expectations, frustrations, and assumptions of what, for example, IPP Office expected far more innovation from the banks on areas such as the VE funding, and this community trust and their innovation, and why doesn't the development finance system work as a development finance system, for example? and the private banks coming to bring solutions to the IPP office. And that's not to say all of them. There are banks that were open and engaged with Treasury and with the DMRE on these discussions, but it was just an overall sentiment that was expressed by a number of interviewees. What was also fascinating is that in the context of this being an energy transition, and I had to ask that question, was this actually an energy transition journey, our IPP program? But environmental and social factors played very limited roles. So it seemed to suggest that not so much. You know, somebody actually said we weren't in an energy transition then, we are in one now. It also came across that our energy transition lacked precise framing and what I call unimaginative investment models. Forgive me for saying it in that crisp way, but that's clearly what came across. So my policy takeaways on this, I won't go through all of them because I think I might be running out of time a little bit, but there was definitely, over those years from 94 to 2009, there was no steady or urgent pace to our energy response. Most of it was done from a policy or implementation perspective, was crisis imposed. I don't think that's necessarily any new, but the data, and when you put it over time and you track it, it's both tragic and true, I guess, in that way. The ambiguity in terms of the limited direction and line of travel, which creates all sorts of misdirected processes then. It was also clear for me that our policymakers' language focused mostly on transactional related issues, not so much systemic needs, and what they needed the financial intermediaries to help in terms of a contribution to a developmental agenda or a energy transition agenda. And the dependency was fascinating for me because the IPP program was so well structured. That's what everybody seemed to expect, that exactly the support that was given to start the program would be the ongoing continued support for the IPP program into infinity. And when I asked the counterfactual question, like, well, what if government withdrew all of that support? You know, and one of the respondents said, well, you know, we will only do what government asks us to do. We won't do more. Now, bear in mind, my interviews ended 2017, partly 2018, and partly a little bit last year as well. COVID-19 might have changed that view because that dependency is unrealistic in the current fiscal context. Large deals dominating and expectations gap. And it also is evident we need different policies if we're going to introduce just transitions on top of empowerment as well. We need some cohesive social policy that captures the context of both. This work also showed me up some real concerns with SA's financial system in terms of the support of transitions. We have great examples of sustainability related innovation in places within our system. You know, we've got Regulation 28, for example, which promotes environmental and social investment. We've got, you know, access to international climate funds. Places like DBSA are hosting the Green Climate Fund interventions as well as the GEF interventions. But a lot of what we have is not yet joined up and coherent. And I believe Treasury is trying to pull this together under a sustainable finance framework and working agenda, which is really useful. But it strikes me that our intensity of, or our ambition about how intense we want the environmental and social objectives to be is more than likely going to be limited by the structure of our financial system. Because we have a concentration of large banks that focus on large businesses mainly, and there is limited access for the smaller, medium businesses and vulnerable groups. And surveys were done in 2007, 11, and 2014 by different groups, looking at how the banks mainly are responding to sustainability issues. And as time went along, it was fascinating that the 4 banks evolved, but some of the smaller banks servicing small and medium enterprise businesses didn't believe they had a role necessarily. What's also clearer for me rather, and this is a global observation, not only South Africa observation, is the relationship amongst the actors in the financial system is unclear. How does a DFI relate to a private sector, a private bank, for example, and how will they both contribute to financial inclusion, access to finance? Whose role is what, and who is waiting for the other to act, for example. Some coherence of that system working together as a system would be useful. And while we are a deeply sophisticated financial system with capabilities, these are very selectively applied. And what does that lead itself to? Innovations that might come back to bite us, in terms of financial crises. These greenwashing risks, for example, just because you issued a green bond, it might look like, wow, that bank's really doing well. But is that deeply true? Or is there just a refinancing happening with no necessarily real economy impact? And the other thing, which is also a global concern, is that it's not necessarily a guarantee that a coal or fossil fuel investment policy might necessarily deliver a higher clean energy investment agenda. So the fact that you're not investing in one does not necessarily mean funding is being deployed into the other. So maybe drawing to conclusions, towards a future financing of SA's energy transition, I go back and I apologize to those who thought that the chat might be primarily about financial structures or specific numbers and risk and return profiles. Because what stood out for me in the research was that the dialogue between policymakers and financial intermediaries, which is what I came to my research about, was how do you get them to talk to each other a language that both understand to actually open up finance. So it became less about the money. It became about how do we have a conversation about what we want that money to do within the context of a transition. And it's brought me to the space of there's a deeper and more honest dialogue that's necessary. And these are probably more essay as much as they are global reflections. That a conversation that is about a systemic change or a systemic shift as opposed to a transaction-specific type issue. The IPP was fantastic, but many will say it was just an amazing new technological innovation investment program that came into SA, and it was not really about our energy transition at that time, but it is now about our energy transition and how does the REI4P contribute to that and other type procurement programs we have, the municipal one, even a possibility for Eskom to have its own procurement program on clean energy as well. There's also critical around the social empowerment objectives, which matter a lot to South Africa, and the just transition dimensions and that contribution. We actually need to understand what do we want the banks to do and in what way. And why is that important is because the structuring of the BEE participation in the REI4P was in a way just left to the banks and to the DFIs to come up with. But there was something inherently inequitable about those structures over time, and only time showed how inequitable it actually was. We have many players in our financial system, and that relationship is valuable to be both complementary, but more diversity and inclusivity is necessary. And while South Africa has access to international climate funds and other developmental funds, we need to ask more strategically, how can we use this to be impactful? My last point is probably the dying moments of my thesis was 31st of December 2019, UK. Mark Carney was on the radio with Greta Thunberg, BBC4, and they were speaking about what the banks can do and what the financial system would do. And Mark Carney made a comment which actually upset me quite greatly. And he said, well, the financial system is just sitting and waiting for government to say what it wants, and we'll just follow, we will do that. And what struck me is, why is everyone playing this waiting game, waiting for governments? We know that most governments are struggling in many ways, lots of political challenges, but there's an onus of responsibility on every actor within the financial system to do what they can within their circle of influence and to act where they can. So sitting around saying we need government to do this, that, and the other, to me is just a waiting game and buying time to not act, and we can't afford that. I'll end off there. Thank you very much, Rika and Nthabi. I leave you with my picture, which best describes for me both my thesis and also the road ahead for the research I hope to do. And I'll also leave you with a quote that means quite a bit to me, because these are difficult times, and it's disruptive times, and transitions can both be fearful and powerful at the same time. So, but we have to try and do our best to try and move from where we are to where we hope to be. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chantal, for that beautiful presentation of the back end of something that is very complex and intertwined. And yeah, what I'm learning is that what we think brings about change is usually not what brings change, but there are other powers and things, you know, at play. Thank you so much for that. And yeah, please, Nthabi, we're interested in how you were responding to this from your perspective. So thank you for engaging.
Okay, thank you very much, Chantal, for your presentation. It was very informative, provocative, and a reminder that we have a lot to think about and act upon when it comes to the financing of the South African energy transition process. So without any financial background and expertise to my name, I will do my best to respond and try to stimulate a conversation based on your presentation. And I hope that our audience can also join us in the conversation, post your questions, and Chantal will try to respond as best as possible, given we don't have a lot of time anyway. But just to summarize, and I'm not going to go through your whole presentation, Chantal, but just to summarize the key points that you highlighted. I liked one of your first slides where you were talking about what your concerns are on transition-related finance, and the issues that you highlight are the limited role of financial systems, which only looks at the securing more finance for projects, the financiers driving new pathways, and the shallow and short-term responses. But what captured me the most was the premature and inappropriate adoption of financial options unsuited to the country's context. Because I took South Africa, and I was thinking of how, you know, the country contextually is different, and like other countries, of course, you know, they have their own differences. No countries are the same. But I was thinking about the current process that we're going through, the energy transition, and we are currently embarking on this journey that we've never taken before as a country, and you know, within this within our region. And how much can we take as lessons from other countries? I think it's something that we need to keep in mind, given our context, our unique context. And there are examples that we can look at from the North, from Latin America, from Asia, but what is applicable to us, and what kind of, you know, innovative ways can we come up with to ensure that we have a successful energy transition. You also gave examples, you know, highlighting long associations between finance and sustainability. I also liked your timeline, which provides a historical perspective and very helpful in tracing our steps and processes the energy sector has been through in the financial terms, which we don't see often. You know, you usually see, you know, how the energy system has operated on, or where we are with regards to the Independent Power Producers Program, but you know, with regards to the finance system as well, it's nice to see that combination, and this helps to look to also look at the broader context of the country, such as the political influence, which I think you also captured there, and the influence of the financial sector in shaping our economy and the energy systems. The other issue that I thought is worth, you know, thinking more about or talking about, and maybe we can have a conversation here with our audience, is that, and we have chatted about this before, is how large programs are favored than the small programs, you know, and they are overlooked, but the impact that they could have, you know, the positive impact that they could have, and to provide the much needed energy services, is often overlooked. And yeah, we have talked about this before, and how this, you know, how could this be changed so that not only the large programs are focused on, but value is also seen in the smaller programs and projects, particularly also thinking about the South African context. Now, I've had the pleasure of also scanning through your thesis. Thank you very much for sharing it. But going back to your thesis, I was also captured by your 3 objectives, which are stated as follows: to support policymakers to engage with financial systems and communicate what type of support they need for the transition towards new sustainable development pathways. The second objective is to support civil society organizations to engage on linkages between financial systems, climate, and sustainable development. And the last one is to support researchers interested in developing further conceptual and empirical linkages on these issues, which I think all of these are very, very important. And so leading me to maybe a question that we can discuss, or you maybe would like to just expand on right now. So talking about, on slide 16, you talk about towards the future financing South African energy transition. And one of your points, your first point is systemic versus transactional issues. The second one is social and just transition contributions, which is also something that is not often talked about. Everyone is talking about the just energy transition, but what is it exactly in the South African context? What are we talking about when we're talking about the just energy transition? So given the country's context, a just energy transition is what we are and should be striving for to address the socioeconomic inequalities, ensure employment, ensure a sustainable environment for all, equal and sustainable opportunities in the energy sector, and build and strengthen the renewable energy sector. There's so much that needs to be done. We have also talked about these issues before, but can you please share with us some of your thoughts on what is realistically possible? How can we get to a point where policymakers and financial intermediaries can work together towards this goal? What's the role of the other actors? When you talk about, what are the bottom-up approaches to this conversation, and how can those actors be part of this conversation to ensure a sustainable transition that looks at all these elements? And how does this relate to the current transition process in South Africa, taking into account ESCOM, the divisionalization, decommissioning, the IPPs, the REAP program, and all the policy levers that needs to be considered. Maybe we can start there. You pick what you want to start with, but I think if we can just start a conversation, and I welcome our audience to also, if they have some contribution to the issues that I have raised, to the issues that Chantal has raised, and maybe that can lead us to a further conversation about this.
I just want to check with Rika. Is there any flexibility on going a bit over time? No. Okay. I just wanted to check that.
We try and stick till 2 o'clock because people have other commitments or other new meetings at 2 o'clock. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, no problem. I have left my email address on the chat. I see some people have asked for the presentation, and maybe just to put out there, I'm more than happy to have direct conversations. Please feel free to email me, and I'm happy to share my but I'll send my presentation to you and Nthabi, so you can share that with the participants, those that have registered. So Nthabi, I can't fix all the problems. You've raised some really important dimensions, and I feel, I don't know, I've spoken to some local people about where we are as in our transition journey, and I think it is quite sad and dismal, and I think people are feeling quite down, about how we're going to make this work. So there's almost like a theoretical, idealistic response, and then there's a realistic response, which is hard to bridge, between the two. But I think what is hopeful for me is that we have a history of National Treasury especially, opening up space to speak to the banks. We just need to get other parties involved in that conversation, and the power of good examples of those who are working at the community level and come up with those ideas, and opening up space for that. I think the role of academic institutions and think tanks and others outside of those that might be close to the heart of government is even more valuable now than it might have been in the past. To come up with not long papers, but just short, punchy policy briefs that says we can do this, we can do that. And you spoke about the examples. Which countries can we learn from? Argentina is in almost as crazy a situation as South Africa. A downgrade. They're trying to roll out a renewable energy program. They've got IMF at their heels, and debt crisis. So we should be looking for those examples, which is peer-to-peer. And it might involve us also accepting that we are in deep trouble as a nation in terms of financing our transition journey and the dimensions that it needs to incorporate. I think it was somebody on the group, Chris, who mentioned that, we are rated 112 out of 114 nations for our readiness in terms of energy transition. We don't realize how far below the curve we actually are as a nation. So in being able to move forward, for me, one of the first things is that we need to get very realistic and hardcore about where we actually are so we can build up something authentic. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah. Let me maybe help you out a little bit on that, Chantal, just to read one or two of the questions. So thank you for answering those very difficult questions posed to you by Nthabi. I think Arthur asked something, could you elaborate a bit more on the role that foreign external financial flows may be playing a role in South Africa's energy transition? For example, MDBs, export credit agencies, and institutional shareholders. Would you be able to say something shortly about that, or in a short way?
Yeah, sure. I think they play a very valuable role, especially now, given COVID and given the fiscal constraints that we face. So I'm aware, for example, of innovations, money coming in from the Global Environment Fund, which DBSA was trying to structure to use as an equity instrument, to support the BE shareholders and partners, for example. So if we are going to be drawing down on the funding, we need to find the gap that it's filling, and I think it does fulfill a really, really important gap. It does depend on how much that funding, how much COVID actually affects access to finance for places like South Africa and other developmental objectives in other countries. I don't think that world of climate and development finance is as predictable as it was before, because we have some very hardcore immediate challenges.
Great, thank you for that. Nina was asking, do finance institutions not see how their profitability will be impacted by not doing the right thing? Because money has to be, or financing depends on something in the end. What would you respond to that?
Having been a banker and having to fight with my colleagues in the trading room that carbon credits was not going to help us achieve, a better, more sustainable world, I'm not so sure if maybe at headline level, the CEO and others, this is quite an acerbic view, so forgive me, but I think that there are spokespersons within the financial institutions that speak to the issues, but the incentive structures for deal makers and people on the front line of pulling together transactions does not uphold these kind of environmental and social objectives. So they are there on the deals that they can do fast within a year. And I don't see yet how that is, turning over. So the fact that money depends on something in the end, to some extent, the bank's money depends on us depositing money with them, so that they can lend out more money. That's just how banks create loans and move money in the system. So as long as the economy is growing, whether it's green or brown or purple or pink. As long as there's money to lend out in the banks, it's available. So I'm not so sure that at the heart of the financial system that there is deep systemic change as yet. But I hope I'm wrong.
That's amazing. It seems like that even the role of banking has changed from its original idea, for when it was incepted in a sense. So it's become a world on its own, ruling and governing things unseen. I like the idea that you also spoke about, the shadow banking industry, or the reality of these kinds of things that are unseen, but in a way that they have real agency and shape things in the end. And I think a last question, we'll take a last question by Zvinka that just says, thank you for the presentation, but why did you decide to avoid information about the nuclear technology financing? Is there something about that that you'd like to maybe just respond to?
I think it was just scope from my side. In the end, you started a PhD journey thinking you are going to change the world, and then as you gather steam along the way, you're like, I can't do this. I just need to close this down, and focus on one or two technologies. So, Devinka, there was nothing deliberate about the omission, other than the fact that it started becoming out of scope to capture all of the flows. And at the time. So, but I think this is valuable. I can always go back and fix my graphic and add, the nuclear technology flows. So thanks for pointing that out.
Great. Thank you very much for answering that. And then there's a last comment by Odie Stradom saying that he loved your point regarding needing to know what the money must achieve, i.e. that lending is not the end point, but the consequences of such lending. So it seems that there's a kind of a reciprocity, happening, a chicken and egg thing that's also shaping the reality somehow. Nthabi, I'd like to ask you whether you have any final remarks, any final comments, also having looked at the conversation and the questions that were posed. Do you want to respond to any of those?
Not to respond to any of those, but just to say that the presentation that Chantal gave to us today is quite important in the whole conversation of energy transitions, because we are talking about this, but it's as if we disintegrate the conversation. It's not all aligned. When you're talking about energy transitions, the financial part is also talked about, but all in its own stream. So we need to get to a point where policy speaks to finance, speaks to social, speaks to, all these elements. For a rounded up picture, so that it addresses the needs that we have, particularly as a country. It addresses the needs that we have when we're talking about our the REAP program, the financing of ESCOM, for instance. How they are transitioning from coal to renewable energy, and what that means for the country as well. Getting that finance. What are the conditions for that, and what it means for the country, for the system as a whole. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Chantal and Nthabi, for your time and for sharing your expertise and for bringing this important focus to energy transitions into the discussion. And also for highlighting how important this is, especially for in the kind of development context, but also how it's playing out in South Africa, and to have that overview and to have that conversation amongst and alongside and influencing and the sort of more important, the structural transformation conversation. Thank you so much for that. Really appreciate that. And I think for us working also on other themes, whether it's water governance or food production and food governance, or any kind of governance ideas, is always this. I think the silver or the bullet question is sort of, what role does policy play in sort of shaping these transitions? And there's such a huge focus on policy, but we don't often see also what are the other kinds of things that have influences on policy, and what's happening in the world's next to that, whether it's finance or social norms or social movements, or what's happening in the sector by itself. So thank you very much for just making us think about that as well again. And then I'd like to just maybe end today with a kind of a little bit of advertisement for something new that we've done at the CST, and that's something that we've launched earlier this week. I'd like to maybe just do some advertisement for that earlier this week, and I'm going to share my screen, and that's why I'm going a bit slow. We launched the Resilience Hub Southern Africa, and this has been done from the CST, and we thank Dr. Micah Hamman for putting this together. It's a fantastic website, and the link is up there. It's called reshubafrica.org, and it's a kind of platform where we're trying to share everything about this notion of resilience and how it's been implemented in practice. And there's wonderful links on there. So we have all the webinars that's been happening for the past few weeks and months. We have on there. There's some stories from resilient practitioners working with this notion of resilience. There's some tools and processes that people can use when wanting to engage or assess notions of resilience. There's dialogues, some training, there's feature articles, publications and podcasts, and then also community of practice. And we acknowledge our funders and supporters that's been helping us with that, but also the recordings of these webinars are all captured in the webinar section, and you see there's alongside our webinars, there's been running a few others as well, and there's some conversation happening between those things. And it's a little bit more information, and there's some, if you wanted to send some questions, someone will answering that. But that's a really exciting project that's been launched by last Monday. And thank you to Micah for curating that and for putting that together. And I hope we can use that as well as we're going forward and connect with that also within these webinars. So thank you everyone for your time, and we'll see you again in 2 weeks. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.